Our top story, renewed hopes of diplomacy after President Donald Trump said a second round of talks between US and Iran officials could happen in Islamabad over the next 2 days. It comes amid a US blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, reigniting tensions between the two warring sides. Traffic along the critical waterway has remained minimal, keeping oil prices at around $90 per barrel. The closure has also left Asia scrambling as it grapples with one of its worst energy crises in decades. For more insights, we're now joined by Amos Hochstein, managing partner at TWG Global and the former deputy assistant and senior advisor for energy and investment to former US President Joe Biden. He's coming to us live from Hong Kong. Now, Amos, thank you so much for joining us. You argue that this is the worst energy crisis in history, even beyond 1973 and 2022. What specific indicators are you looking at to really make that call? And how close are we to, systemic economic disruption in Asia?
Hi, it's good to be with you here from Hong Kong. Look, in the 1970s, it was a terrible crisis that lasted for 6 months, and the duration is what made it worse. But it was only oil. As Asia is learning all too well, this crisis is about not just oil. It's about 20% of the world's LNG. It's about jet fuel and gasoline and diesel and helium gas and nitrogen for fertilizers. So it is about so much more because it's about products and refined products and petrochemicals that also come from the Middle East. Now, in 2022, I was the advisor to the president then managing the energy crisis when I was at the White House. And that was a disruption, that was a risk concern where prices went up on the basis of a risk that maybe we would lose barrels of oil and gas, which we never actually did. So I think that there is a big difference. What we're facing now in Asia is the risk, because we already have several countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia that have declared emergency, that have gone to 4-day work weeks, whose GDP growth have been cut by almost 50%, where inputs for materials and manufacturing are not available. This is not because prices are rising. They literally are running out of materials and out of fuels. So I think we are already at demand destruction in many economies across Asia. And every day that goes by and every week that goes by, the systemic danger is very dangerous.
Well, Amos, your solution really hinges on massive new infrastructure. But these projects really take years, if not even, decades. What can realistically be done in the short term while the world waits for these bypass corridors to materialize?
Well, number one, the war needs to end in a way that opens the straits for freedom of navigation. We have to have free movement of ships. Right now, there's a lot of optimism in the markets, which is why we're seeing the markets go up today, oil's coming down. But remember this, oil price may be priced today at $90 or $95, but that's just on your TV screen or on your monitor or on your computer. There are no barrels that are selling for that price at Brent. Those barrels are actually in the physical market selling at $140. So if you're living in Asia, your price for that oil and therefore its product is $140. So in the short term, we need to get to a point where the straits are opened completely. The ceasefire is now a week in and the straits are still closed. So we have to open it. My argument for long-term investment is because we have to have a solution to the straits where we make that 21 miles of the Strait of Hormuz irrelevant. We invested 10 years of building terminals in Europe for LNG and pipelines, which is what made it possible to have an alternative to the Russian gas in 2022. But had we not built that infrastructure, it wouldn't matter how much LNG was available from the United States, because it wouldn't be able to get there. So we need to start sometime, even if it takes a while. So we should build more infrastructure in UAE and Saudi Arabia. We should build infrastructure from Kuwait and Iraq to Turkey. And we should build infrastructure for storage here across Asia. Singapore already has a lot of storage for shipping. It should also have storage for, jet fuel and for diesel. And we should do that in Singapore and Tokyo and India, and so that the region is covered in times of emergency. It may take time, a few years, but it will cost more if we don't do it.
Absolutely. Preparing ahead is crucial for any nation. But, you've pushed for the Iraq corridor before without success in that sense. What has fundamentally changed now that makes you think that the political obstacles can actually be overcome?
So I think you're right. I spent a lot of time traveling around in Iraq and Turkey and Kuwait and so on, trying to create that corridor. But here's the difference. We do big things in this world after crises, after wars in particular. So I think that the result of this war should be the world coming together, the Gulf states in the Middle East, leading Asian nations, and the United States and Europe to do this now, because this is the moment to get to get beyond the political pettiness that has resulted in not building this infrastructure.
This vision assumes strong U.S. leadership and coordination. And given the current geopolitical fragmentation, is it really realistic to expect Washington to mobilize that kind of coalition? And what happens if China really steps in instead? Well, Amos, just to repeat the question again, you have actually seen that this solution kind of pushed forward in terms of the corridor. But this vision really assumes strong U.S. leadership and coordination. Given the current geopolitical fragmentation, is it realistic to expect Washington to kind of mobilize that kind of coalition? And what happens if really China steps in?
Yeah, you're right. I'm very, very nervous about the fact that the U.S. is abdicating its role as a leader, but I don't lose hope. I still think that that is the right role for us. Look, I think China is going to want to play that role, and I think that instead of China playing that role alone, or the United States playing it alone, I think this should actually be an area where the U.S. and China can work together. This is something where we are, when it comes to energy markets and financial markets, we are one world. We cannot have a financial crisis in Asia and not have that affect the U.S. markets, and vice versa. We are integrated whether we like it or not. So I think this is a moment where I'm not calling on this for the U.S. to do it without China. I think that if the U.S. doesn't do it with China, China will do it without the United States. And that will be a big mistake for everyone. I think it will be a bad idea for the United States, but I actually think globally it will be a mistake. We should integrate energy systems and infrastructure, not isolate them.
And from an Asian perspective, where countries are already, cutting industrial output and flights, what should governments here be prioritizing right now to cushion the impact of this shock?
Well, one, I think that they should be very honest about what's happening. And I think that there's a cheerleading going on in the market every day. Oh, there's optimism. We're going to have talks in a couple of days. The talks don't matter. The PR doesn't matter. What matters is that the straits are still closed. There is no products coming to Asia for several weeks. So I think there should be an emergency, or an urgency rather, to government actions across the region. They should be bringing the industry together. They should have meetings with the financial leaders, with corporate leaders, to understand and get a reality check. How many days do we have before jet fuel is running out? How much time do we have before inputs? There was a leading company in Japan that has announced that it cannot continue manufacturing of things like bathtubs and toilets because they don't have the inputs. There are companies in Malaysia that cannot continue to manufacture surgical gloves. This is the beginning signs. And I get that there's always a nervousness. Look, I worked in the White House. There's a nervousness to send a message of panic to the market. But if you don't act with urgency and the straits are closed for another week or 2 weeks, that could have devastating impact. And so I think it's important to get ahead of that and understand from corporations and manufacturers how many days before they run out of inputs, and to communicate that to see what they can do to help resolve it.
Well, thank you so much for answering our questions and sharing them based off your experience as well. Amos Hochstein, Managing Partner, TWG Global, former Deputy Assistant and Senior Advisor for Energy and Investment to Joe Biden.